Welcome back, everyone. This is our second video as we work our way through Historia Civilis' videos on Julius Caesar. I'm going right down their playlist as they have it put together. So if you didn't see yesterday's video, which was the first one, I'll put a link in the description below to that reaction, as well as always, the link to the original content creator for this video. And sometimes I forget to put that in there, and so thank you for those of you who remind me when that's blank, so I can go in and make sure it's put back in there. So if that's the case, just let me know in the comments and I'll fix it. But we're going to dive into Caesar versus the Helvetii today. One of the really cool things about studying Caesar's wars in Western Europe is how many of these names of these Gallic tribes and the Germanic tribes are names that we still recognize today because they become the names for those regions as they still exist today. The Belgae, for example, give their name to Belgium. Helvetii, I believe, are from the area that would today be modern Switzerland. And they become the first of several tribes that he's going to take on in these wars over the coming 10 years or so. So let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Remember back to Caesar's year as consul, when there had been a coordinated effort to sabotage his career by assigning him to govern the woodland and country lanes of Italy. After achieving dominance over the Senate, he had replaced this dead-end job with the governorship of two provinces, Illyricum and Cisalpine Gaul. Governing two provinces at once was unusual but not unprecedented. Then, when the governor of neighboring Transalpine Gaul unexpectedly died, he had that province assigned to himself as well.
So look at this. He basically rules the entire northern portion of the Roman Empire. This is an incredible amount of territory. This is, typically you get a governorship of one area. Sometimes you get two. You never get three. But nobody's saying no to Julius Caesar at this point. And this is going to be key because now he not only controls the northern part of Italy, which is very Roman, but now he's got control of this kind of new frontier territory that is going to become the basis for conquering all of Gaul over the next 10 years.
By the way, for the sake of simplicity, I keep on using the word governor, but the Romans used the words proconsul and propraetor, which doesn't exactly mean the same thing. Basically, if the Senate took a former consul and put them in charge of a province or at the head of an army, they were now a proconsul, which legally granted them some of the old command authority that they used to possess when they were in office. Command authority, the Romans had their own word for this too, Imperium. A person with Imperium was authorized to channel the power and authority of the state in order to enact their will. So governors, generals, judges, and high-ranking politicians literally embodied the Roman state.
And what's key here is that as proconsul, he's going to have military abilities. He's going to have the not only kind of what he had as consul in Rome, but now also that old general job he had too, kind of melded into one.
Diplomats also had Imperium. There are famous stories about the over-the-top arrogance of Roman diplomats, talking down their noses at foreign kings. But look at it from their point of view. If Roman diplomats thought that they were the embodiment of the Roman state, it would be inappropriate for them to bow to a foreign king. It's easy to see why the Romans were awful diplomats. Another thing to keep in mind going forward, a person with Imperium was immune from legal prosecution. You could always charge them later as a private citizen, but not while they had Imperium.
And that carries over to today. There's a lot of arguments that the same is true for a United States president, that as a sitting president, he really can't be charged with a crime. Now, you can impeach him, remove him from office, and then charge him, or you can charge him after he leaves office, but there's really not any precedent for actually charging a sitting president of the United States with a crime.
So, on January 1st of 58 BCE, Caesar became the proconsul in charge of Illyricum, Cisalpine Gaul, and Transalpine Gaul for a 5-year term. These three provinces had a total of 4 legions assigned to them, which at full strength would have been around 20,000 men. Caesar immediately began raising 2 more legions at his personal expense, bringing his total up to 6 legions and 30,000 men.
So, there are all these divisions of the Roman military. In fact, why don't we take a look at it real quick? So the best way to kind of think of this in your own mind, and we've talked about this on other videos, is to imagine a century as similar to a modern, well, maybe not so much a modern company, because a company's a little bigger than that. It'd almost be like a couple of platoons. But it would have been similar to like a Civil War era company, about 80 men. So then you have a cohort, which is 6 centuries, about 480 men. So now you're talking about like a battalion size. And then a legion would be like a brigade size. Or, a Civil War division, 5,500 soldiers, might even be, I guess you could say it's probably like a division, even in something like World War II. And then when you're talking the size that Caesar has, where he's got like 6 legions, now you're talking about an army, or at least a large corps. So, legion, division, cohort, battalion, century, like a company. I guess that's kind of the easiest way to think of it.
Last year, when Caesar had secured new provinces, he had also given himself the power to appoint his own legates, which was usually the Senate's job. Just a reminder, a legate was the person in charge of each legion, so in this case he had 6 jobs to fill. He gave one of these positions to a man named Labienus. Caesar and Labienus were the same age, and they had become good friends during the Catiline conspiracy, when Caesar had served as praetor and Labienus had been a tribune of the plebs. During Caesar's year as consul, Labienus had served with him as praetor. This made Labienus eligible for a province of his own, but instead he chose to come with Caesar and serve as his right-hand man.
So you see the loyalty here with men like Labienus, men who are on the rise themselves, men who are about Caesar's age, who might find themselves competing for influence, but instead kind of hanging on to the coattails of a guy like Caesar.
Later, when Caesar would get distracted by the day-to-day governance of the provinces, Labienus would be left in charge of the army. When circumstance required Caesar's presence elsewhere, Labienus would govern the provinces in his place. When Caesar's final term as governor ended, he would have Labienus appointed his successor. Near the beginning of the year, Caesar received word that a large tribe, the Helvetii, had uprooted and were migrating west. On their current trajectory, they were going to cut through Transalpine Gaul. Caesar ordered his legions to mobilize.
And isn't it interesting here, if you look at the map, and I don't know how exactly accurate this is, but Transalpine Gaul, for the most part, sticks to the sea, and you can understand why. It's easy access by sea to get back to Rome, to get your supplies, things like that. The further inland you go, the more vulnerable you become to all of these tribes that are out here. But they've got this territory that kind of reaches real high up here, and that's the part that they're going to end up going across.
And to travel to the edge of Roman territory near modern Geneva. There he had them break down a bridge over a river that the Helvetii would need to cross. When the Helvetii realized that there were 6 legions standing in their path, they formally requested passage through Roman territory. Caesar sent a response, saying something along the lines of, "Wait there, I'll think about it." A week passed in silence. Finally, Caesar sent a messenger denying their request, at which time they discovered that the Romans had secretly constructed a 28-kilometer line of defenses in front of the river.
In the week they're sitting there, they had secretly constructed a 28-kilometer line of defenses. This is one of the just the ridiculous things that Caesar's armies do throughout his time in command. Is their engineering feats are just incredible. The speed and skill at which they throw up fortifications, the speed and skill at which they put up bridges and get their army across, the way that they're able to move large numbers of men and supply them and just go from one fight to another, the way they're able to fool the enemy. It's incredible what Caesar is able to do. And he buys them a week for them to throw up these fortifications. It's just unreal.
What was Caesar doing here? If you want to give him the benefit of the doubt, you can. He would argue that the Romans were allied with many of the Golic tribes in the area, and they didn't want 300,000 militaristic Helvetii moving into their territory.
And that is what he argues. And as we've talked about before when we talk about Caesar, one of the difficult things about, as somebody mentioned yesterday, we have a ton of information. For events that took place 2,000 years ago, we have ridiculous amounts of details about what happened in these wars. The problem is they all come from the same source for the most part, which is Julius Caesar. And as with all sources, we have to take into consideration who is writing, why are they writing, what are their biases, what are they hoping to accomplish. Caesar, obviously, what does he want to accomplish here? He wants to write a story that's going to make him and his army look really good. And so he's going to probably inflate numbers of the enemy. He's going to probably inflate their capabilities. He's probably going to talk about what a difficult feat they were facing. He's going to make this look as good for the Romans as possible, and we just don't have the sources from the other side or people from the outside looking in to really be able to tell us any different. So everything has to be taken with a grain of salt.
Setting the delicate balance of power. But in my opinion, Caesar wasn't acting in good faith here. He had started mustering extra legions before the Helvetii had even entered the picture. If you ask me, this had more to do with Caesar settling his debts than it did with maintaining a status quo. The Helvetii were upset by Caesar's refusal. Some of them were like, to hell with this, and decided to independently cross the river anyways.
And understand, it wasn't just as simple as the Helvetii could just go back to where they were. I believe they had destroyed their villages. They were moving. They had burned everything. There was nothing to go back to. They had committed to this.
Caesar had anticipated this. He didn't have enough men to defend the entire 28-kilometer line at once, but wherever a group of Helvetii tried to push, Caesar and his men converged on that location. The Helvetii made several attempts over several days, but Caesar repulsed them every time. The Helvetii were beaten, and decided to go around Roman territory by marching north. Before too long, some of Rome's Golic allies started to get word of a massive Helvetii migration coming their way, and sent panicked messages to Caesar asking for assistance. With this thin justification, Caesar set off in pursuit of the Helvetii, and caught up with them at the Arar River, which we now...
So, a lot of these, they call them allies, but basically what you have is a lot of these Gallic tribes that are near or within Roman territory are becoming Romanized. They're starting to take on the culture of the Romans. They're starting to take on the way they dress and the way they do their hair and the way they operate their government. And so they're building, they're not Romans themselves, but they're building close ties with the Romans. And so this is a solid justification in Caesar's mind for defending these people. These are our people. They want to be like us. They're on our side. We need to protect them against these wild Helvetii.
Now called the Saône. The Helvetii were having difficulty with the river, and a simple crossing had dragged on for weeks. Caesar launched a surprise nighttime attack, but due to low visibility and general confusion, he was not very successful, and most of the Helvetii on his side of the river were able to retreat safely into the woods. The next morning, Caesar and his men started construction on a bridge across the river. They were finished within hours, and the next day Caesar and his 6 legions had crossed the river, and they were on to tracking the rest of the Helvetii. When Caesar caught up with them, the Helvetii sent a diplomat to meet with him. They didn't really accomplish anything, they just ended up airing grievances at each other. It now seemed pretty clear that there was going to be a battle. Caesar assembled his legions and sent his 4,000 cavalry forward to screen his infantry as they advanced. The cavalry walked right into an ambush. The ambush was small in scale, but the Romans still took heavy losses and were routed. This was Caesar's first proper military encounter in Gaul, and it ended in defeat. But
so there's some parallels here to what happened at the Battle of Agincourt between the French and the English a couple of millennia later, where the French kind of marched down through the center at a small force of English in the center, while the English wait on the sides in the woods to ambush them when they come through. And of course they had a bunch of archers as well, but just made me think of that.
Worse. At least the cavalry took the brunt of the attack, and were able to disengage when they were beaten. If the infantry had walked into this, it could have gone a lot differently. After this, Caesar must have felt humbled. because he moved much more cautiously. The Helvetii continued their migration north, and Caesar shadowed them the entire way. Whenever they stopped moving, the Helvetii would deploy for battle, but Caesar never took the bait. This went on for several days. One day, the Helvetii ended their march in front of a steep hill. Caesar pulled Labienus aside, and together they hatched a plan. In the middle of the night, Labienus was to march off with 2 of Caesar's most experienced legions. The plan was for Labienus to march all the way around the Helvetii position in the dark, and take the hill behind them before the sun came up. At dawn, Caesar would march out and deploy for battle. Labienus was to hold his position until the moment he saw Caesar's forces come into contact with the Helvetii. When that happened, he was to charge downhill and hit them in the rear. A key ingredient to this plan was trusting that the Helvetii wouldn't be stupid enough to attack uphill, even though they would outnumber Labienus' detachment 7 or 8 to 1.
But in that case, you're trusting that Labienus can hold the hill while Caesar can come up and attack from the rear. So either way, you're probably in a good situation.
If they did attack uphill, that would screw up the plan a little bit, but all Labienus would need to do was hold off the Helvetii until Caesar could come to the rescue. That's why he had the 2 most experienced legions with him. So in the middle of the night, Labienus marched off with his legions, and at dawn, Caesar and the remaining 4 legions marched out of their fortified encampment to meet the Helvetii, making as much commotion as possible. He sent his cavalry to scout ahead. Before long, his scouts came back, with reports that there were Helvetii all over the hillside, and Labienus was nowhere to be found. This was bad. Caesar abruptly threw his legions into a defensive line. Then he sent out all of his scouts with very simple orders. Find out what happened to Labienus' legions. They stayed deployed like this all day, prepared for an overwhelming attack, but it never came. Finally, the scouts came back. Labienus had been waiting on the hill the entire time. The first report had been wrong. The Helvetii had been completely unaware that anything was going on. Caesar must have been pretty angry because when he was writing his account of this incident 12 years later, he names names and throws the scouts responsible under the bus. By this point, it was near dusk, so Caesar sent a messenger to Labienus, telling...
And he names names regularly, like when he wanted to build somebody up, when he wanted to talk about a particular soldier. And this is one of the things that's really cool about what Caesar's writing, is that we get to hear the names of soldiers in the ranks who perform bravely, much like we do in modern times. And we get to hear some of these names of these guys that fight on these ancient battlefields over 2,000 years ago, and specifically what they did. But again, how much of it is true and how much of it is Caesar wanting to promote one of his cronies to get him a good position later on? We don't know for sure.
Him to abandon the plan and come back to camp. The next day, Caesar finally had to deal with the fact that his army was down to 2 more days of food. Some of his Golic allies had been promising a food shipment for a while now, but these were Gauls of questionable loyalty, and so far none had arrived. But there was an allied Golic outpost nearby, and if the Romans left first thing in the morning, they could make it there by sundown. That was the new plan. Caesar would get the food himself, and then he would continue to shadow the Helvetii. The Romans marched away, but unbeknownst to Caesar, it was his turn to be shadowed.
Now, it's important to note that at least according to Caesar, Caesar's got about 40,000 men. According to Caesar, the Helvetii have something like 360,000 people. Now, about 90,000 of them are actual fighting troops. And then the rest, 270,000 or so, are men, women, and children that aren't fighting. Modern estimates put the fighting number no more than maybe 40 or 50,000, because again, Caesar's probably inflating the numbers, but he says that the Romans were outnumbered something like 9 to 1 when you count men, women, and children on the other side.
Just begun his forced march to resupply when all of a sudden he had Helvetii attacking the rear of his column. He didn't see this one coming. The infantry at the rear of the column turned to fight, and Caesar ordered all of his cavalry to go and help them. There was a small hill nearby, so he repositioned the rest of his infantry there and had them deploy for battle. This may have taken several hours, especially since Caesar had 10,000 raw recruits under his command. He put his 4 experienced legions up at the front, and his 2 inexperienced ones in reserve. When the infantry was finally in position, a signal was given. And
now, it would have been tempting, if you are outnumbered, as Caesar says he was, significantly, to put every man on the line to give yourself the best chance. So it's a gutsy call to put units in reserve and shorten your front line, but it's part of the Roman strategy, how they do things, and to keep men fresh and to keep men in reserve so that you can plug holes when they occur instead of committing everybody to battle at one time.
The Romans who had been holding the Helvetii off fell back to the Roman line. The Helvetii advanced slowly up the hill, and the Romans held their ground. When they were in range, the 4 legions at the front threw their javelins and sent their first 2 lines charging down the hill.
And this is, typical Roman strategy. They have javelins that are kind of one-time weapons. You throw them, and then you get into your combat. You've got your shield wall. You're going to hold your formation. The whole key to the Romans' strategy for infantry is to hold their formation and to kind of cycle those troops to keep them fresh. And that's how you continuously are able to win battles against large numbers.
The fighting was evenly matched for some time, but the Romans held the high ground, and the Helvetii gradually started to be pushed down the hill. Suddenly, a third army entered the battlefield. 2 local Golic tribes had allied themselves with the Helvetii. They had been sluggish in their pursuit of the Romans, but all 15,000 of them arrived with the battle already in progress.
And this is why you need that reserve, because otherwise you've got nothing available to deal with this.
In this period, it was very common for armies to commit most of their men in the first wave, in the hopes that their overwhelming numbers would cause a rout. The Romans were weirdos, and their system kept a large percentage of their army in reserve.
This is why
it was designed for moments like this.
Yep.
The Roman third line was a cross-section of the most experienced soldiers under Caesar's command. There were, at most, 6,500 of them, but probably less.
But yeah, they're only outnumbered 2-1. Those are great odds for the Romans.
And when they moved up, they stopped the 15,000 Helvetii reinforcements in their tracks. Neither side had a clear advantage, and the battle dragged on all day. Caesar held his raw recruits back. It wasn't clear that they were capable of holding their own against the Helvetii, and Caesar didn't want to risk it. The Romans kept on making incremental progress here and there, but it was exhausting work, and both sides were taking heavy losses. The sun went down, and they were still fighting. Eventually, the Helvetii had been reduced by an astonishing 2/3, and they pulled back, dejected and thoroughly beaten. The Romans were totally exhausted, even in victory. They had lost 5,000 men, which was a quarter of their most experienced soldiers. Caesar's army was truly shaken, and it took them a full 3 days to recover and tend to their wounded. They had captured some Helvetii supply wagons, so their food problem was now taken care of. Once the Romans were well enough to be on the march again, they were immediately met with a Helvetii delegation offering terms of surrender. Caesar accepted. He had the Helvetii hand over all of their weapons, allowed them to leave Gaul with their lives and go home, on the condition that in the future they would provide fighting men to the Roman Republic upon request.
And this is a pretty common thing, a common treaty that the Romans would offer is that, okay, you submit to us, you make yourself available as auxiliaries when we need you, and we will call upon you at some point to prove yourself to us. But where are they going to go home to? They've destroyed the home that they had come from. They can't go back, but they're not allowed to proceed forward to the place they were intending to go.
They agreed. This was the beginning of the so-called Golic Wars, a series of campaigns that began here in 58 BCE and ended in 51 BCE, just after the Battle of Alesia. Campaigns that began ostensibly to stabilize neighboring Gaul by restricting the movement of people, ended with its subjugation.
All right, so I did another video about the Golic, series of videos about the Golic Wars a while back on Kings and Generals series, which was fantastic as well. So I'll put a link in the description to that video, the one that covers this same topic, the same part of that, if you want to see another perspective on that. Let me know in the comment section below what you think. Add to the discussion and hit that like button if you would. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.